Marco Dante was striding toward his armored SUV when something small tugged at the sleeve of his tailored navy suit. It wasn't a rival hitman, and it wasn't a federal agent serving a warrant. It was a dirty, crumpled $5 bill. He looked down. A tiny girl, no older than 6, stood there in a faded pink t-shirt and worn jeans. Her hair was unkempt, and her hands were trembling violently as she held the cash up like it was a holy offering. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is all I saved." His security detail moved instantly, hands reaching for weapons, stepping in to intercept the threat. But Marco raised a single, tattooed hand, freezing them in place. Men usually paid him in thick envelopes to save their own lives. No one had ever paid him $5. Slowly, the man who owned the city crouched down, letting his expensive trousers hit the dirty pavement until he was eye level with her. "What are you doing, kid?" he asked. She swallowed hard, fighting back tears of exhaustion. "I want to hire you," she said. "Because the bad men took Mommy, and the police said they couldn't help." That made the boss pause. She leaned in, desperate. "They said if I told, they'd hurt her." That's when Marco noticed the dark bruise on her small arm and the terror in her eyes. Marco slowly reached out and took the $5 bill. Not because he wanted the money, but because the job she was offering was the only one that mattered. The war Marco Dante was about to start for this little girl didn't just break the rules. It was about to break the whole city. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment, "Justice," below. Don't also forget to turn on your notification bells so you get notified when we release other interesting stories. Now, let's get started. The sidewalk outside the Venetian Club was clear, not by accident, but by fear. People gave Marco Dante space the way ships gave way to an iceberg. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the afternoon sun, his mind already on the next collection, the next territory dispute, the next act of necessary violence. His security detail moved in a tight phalanx around him, a living wall of black wool and hidden holsters designed to keep the world out. Then, the wall breached. It didn't happen with force. There was no shout, no sudden rush of an assassin. It was just a blur of faded pink cotton slipping between two massive bodyguards who were looking for threats at eye level, not knee level. One of the men, a giant named Russo, spotted the movement and lunged, his hand going instinctively to the semi-automatic inside his jacket. "Boss, watch out!" Russo barked, stepping in to shield Marco with his body. But Marco didn't recoil. He looked down. The threat wasn't a gunman. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, standing in the center of the pavement like a weed growing through a crack in marble. The contrast was violent. Marco stood in a $3,000 bespoke suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his posture rigid with authority. The girl was a portrait of ruin. Her jeans were frayed at the hems, stained with city grime. Her pink t-shirt was 2 sizes too big, hanging off her frail shoulders, the collar stretched and worn. The silence that fell over the street was heavier than the traffic noise that had preceded it. The bodyguards stood frozen, unsure of the protocol for a crying child. Marco stared at her. He saw the way the wind bit at her bare arms, the way her unwashed hair tangled around a face that had seen too many tears and not enough soap. She looked like something the city had chewed up and spat out, the exact kind of debris Marco usually stepped over without a second glance. But she didn't step back. She didn't look at the terrifying men towering over her. Her eyes, red-rimmed and wide, were locked on Marco. She was trembling, vibrating with a fear so intense it seemed to rattle her bones, yet her feet were planted. She held her ground in the shadow of the devil, clutching something in her fist. Marco raised a hand, a silent command that made his security detail step back. The tension in the air shifted from physical danger to something stranger, something uncomfortable. He looked from the heavy gold watch on his wrist to the dirt under her fingernails. The distance between them wasn't just height, it was a universe. She was everything he had left behind: weakness, poverty, desperation. And yet she had broken the perimeter that grown men feared to approach. "You're lost, little one," Marco said, his voice deep and gravelly, expecting her to run. She didn't run. She stepped closer. Marco glanced at the $5 bill in her shaking hand, then back to her face. "You're confused," he said, his tone dismissive but not unkind. "This isn't a candy store, and I'm not a cop. If you're in trouble, the precinct is on 4th Street. Go tell the officer at the desk." He signaled for Russo to open the car door, ready to end this strange interruption. "I did," Nora said. The words were soft, brittle like dry leaves, but they stopped Marco's hand midair. He turned back slowly. The girl hadn't moved. A tear finally broke free, cutting a clean track through the grime on her cheek. "I went to the police station," she continued, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I waited on the bench for a long time. Then a big man in a uniform told me to stop making up stories. He said mommies don't just disappear. He said she probably just went for a drink and I should go home and wait." Marco felt a cold sneer curl inside his chest. It wasn't directed at the girl, but at the familiar incompetence of the system he operated outside of. He knew exactly the type of cop she had met, overworked, underpaid, and indifferent to the problems of people who lived in the wrong zip code. To the law, a missing single mother from the projects wasn't a crime, she was a statistic. "They wouldn't listen," Nora choked out, looking down at her worn sneakers. "I told them about the men. I told them they dragged her into the van. The policeman just laughed. He said I watched too much TV." She looked up again, and the raw intensity of her gaze pinned Marco to the spot. "He said he couldn't help me. But everyone says you can help anyone. They whisper about you. They say you're the boss of everything." Marco's jaw tightened. The irony tasted like ash. The good guys had abandoned her because she was poor and insignificant. They had followed the law, which said wait 24 hours, file a report, trust the process. And while they followed the law, a woman was likely terrified and bleeding in the back of a van. "So you came to the bad guy," Marco said quietly, the realization settling over him like a heavy coat. "I came to the man who makes things happen," she corrected him, extending the crumpled bill again. "Please. I don't have anyone else." Marco let out a long, slow breath, the sound hissing through his teeth like steam escaping a pressure valve. The street around them seemed to vanish, the honking taxis, the nervous bodyguards, the towering skyline, until it was just him and the child. Slowly, deliberately, Marco bent his knees. He ignored the protest of his Italian suit trousers and the grit of the sidewalk as he lowered himself completely. For the first time in years, the king of the city was on his knees, not to beg, but to listen. He was now eye level with Nora. Up close, the damage was worse. He could see the faint purple bruise blooming on her forearm where someone had grabbed her too hard. "You know what I am, don't you?" Marco asked, his voice a low rumble. Nora nodded, her chin trembling. "You're the scary man." "Yeah. I am." Marco didn't blink. "And scary men don't work for $5, kid. We work for favors. We work for blood. It's all I have," she whispered, pushing the crumpled bill closer to his chest. "Please." Marco looked at the money. It was warm from her hand, stained with sweat and desperation. In his world, a contract required a handshake and a drink. In hers, this was a life savings. If he walked away now, he wasn't just refusing a job, he was confirming that the world was exactly as cruel as those cops said it was. He looked at the bruise on her arm again. A rule in the underworld was simple: women and children were off limits. Someone had broken that rule. "Who took her, Nora?" Marco asked, his tone sharpening into something lethal. "I need a name. Or a face." Nora sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "I didn't hear a name. But the man who drove the van. He had a drawing on his neck. A green snake." Marco went very still. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. The Vipers. It wasn't just random street thugs. It was the Vipers, a sprawling, chaotic syndicate trying to bleed into his territory. They dealt in everything Marco refused to touch. If the Vipers had her mother, they weren't holding her for ransom. They were shipping her out. The decision slammed into Marco like a physical weight. He wasn't doing this for charity anymore. This was an act of war. He reached out, his hand engulfing hers, and took the $5 bill. He didn't shove it in his pocket carelessly. He folded it with the precision of a banknote and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "Contract accepted," Marco said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You just hired the scary man." Marco stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, like a heavy gate closing. He brushed the dust from his knees, but his eyes didn't leave Nora's face. The softness that had been there a moment ago evaporated, replaced by a mask of granite. "Russo," Marco said. The name cracked like a whip in the silent street. The head of security stepped forward instantly. "Boss? Take the girl inside. Put her in the private booth in the back. Get Mrs. Chen to feed her, anything she wants. And put 2 men on the door. If anyone who isn't me tries to talk to her, you break their legs." Russo nodded, sensing the shift in the air. "Understood." Marco watched for a split second as Russo gently guided Nora toward the safety of the club, then he turned on his heel. The transformation was instantaneous. The man who had crouched on the sidewalk was gone. In his place walked a predator who had just caught the scent of blood. He strode toward the armored SUV, his stride long and aggressive. His men scrambled to open the door, flinching as he passed. They had seen Marco angry before, shouting, throwing glasses, but they had rarely seen him like this. This wasn't a temper tantrum. It was the cold, quiet focus of a butcher sharpening a knife. He slid into the leather back seat. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing out the noise of the city. The silence inside was suffocating. Marco stared at his reflection in the darkened window. He felt the outline of the crumpled $5 bill in his pocket against his chest. It burned like a brand. The Vipers. Snakes. They were sloppy, violent, and without honor, but they had made a fatal error. They had brought their filth into his city. Marco pulled his phone from his jacket. His thumb hovered over a contact labeled simply the cleaners. He didn't hesitate. He pressed call. It rang once. "Yeah, boss?" A voice answered, tinny and distorted. "Cancel the collection run," Marco said, his voice dropping to a register that made the driver glance nervously at the rearview mirror. "Drop everything. I want every shooter we have at the shipyard in 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Boss, that's Viper territory. If we roll up there heavy, it's going to look like an invasion." "It is an invasion," Marco cut him off. He looked out the window as the SUV's engine roared to life, a low growl that matched the one in his chest. "They took a woman. A mother. And I have a paying client who wants her back." "A client? Who?" Marco's fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. "A very serious investor. Load the rifles, Luca. We aren't knocking on the door. We're kicking it in." The police needed warrants, judges, and paperwork. They needed 48 hours to declare a person missing and a week to assign a detective. Marco Dante needed 10 minutes. As the convoy of black SUVs tore down the expressway, Marco's phone became a command center. He didn't call the authorities, he called the streets. The order went out to every corner boss, every fence, and every street-level dealer on the payroll. Find the van. Find the snake tattoo. Do it now. Usually, Marco's network was a web of silence, designed to hide crimes. Tonight, it was a dragnet designed to expose one. The city began to talk. In a pawn shop in the Bronx, a nervous fence checked his surveillance tapes. On a corner in Queens, a lookout spotted a gray van running a red light. In the darkest alleys of the meatpacking district, whispers moved faster than fiber optics. The underworld was terrified of Marco Dante, and the only thing scarier than his anger was his disappointment. No one wanted to be the guy who missed the clue. 6 minutes into the drive, Marco's phone buzzed. It was Luca. "We got him, boss." Luca's voice crackled over the speaker, tight with adrenaline. One of the dock workers on our payroll just clocked a gray Sprinter van entering the west side shipping yards. Viper tags on the bumper. They're trying to move her onto a cargo ship. Marco's eyes went to the rearview mirror. He saw his own reflection, stone-cold lethal. For years he had used his power to take. He took territory, he took money, he took lives. He had built an empire on fear. But as he looked at the city blurring past the window, he realized that for the first time, he was using that fear to give something back. The Vipers thought they were untouchable because they operated in the shadows. They didn't realize that Marco owned the shadows. "Turn the convo," Marco said calmly. "We're going to the docks." The driver yanked the wheel, the heavy SUV drifting across 3 lanes of traffic as the entire motorcade executed a precision U-turn. Sirens wailed in the distance, police responding to some other, lesser emergency, but they were irrelevant. The law was too slow. Justice was currently doing 80 miles an hour in a customized Cadillac Escalade. Marco checked the load in his pistol one last time. He pictured Nora's trembling hands and the $5 bill resting against his heart. The Vipers were about to learn a very expensive lesson. You can steal money, and you can steal turf, but you never, ever steal a mother from a child in Marco Dante's town. The hunting season was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The SUVs didn't slow down at the gate. The lead vehicle, reinforced with a heavy steel bull bar, smashed through the chain-link fence like it was made of spiderwebs. Metal screeched, sparks showered the asphalt, and the convoy roared into the shipyard, high beams cutting through the gloom of the shipping containers. Before the Vipers guarding the perimeter could even raise their weapons, Marco's men were out. Doors flew open. Boots hit the ground. The air filled with the sharp, rhythmic crack-crack-crack of suppressed rifles. Marco didn't wait for the "all clear." He stepped out of his vehicle, his pistol drawn, moving with a fluidity that betrayed his years in the trenches before he sat in the boardroom. Usually, a boss stayed behind the armored glass while his soldiers did the dirty work. But tonight Marco walked point. A Viper thug popped out from behind a blue container, raising a shotgun. Marco didn't flinch. He fired 2 rounds center mass, head, without breaking his stride. The man crumpled to the concrete. "Clear left!" Russo shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaotic symphony of the raid. "Push forward!" Marco commanded, his voice ice cold. "Check every container. If they resist, put them down." This wasn't a gang fight, it was a liquidation. The Vipers were street brawlers, used to intimidating shopkeepers and tourists. Marco's crew were professionals, ex-military, precision shooters, men who treated violence as a trade. The difference was brutal. The Vipers panicked, firing wildly into the dark, their shots pinging harmlessly off the heavy steel of the containers. Marco's men moved in teams, slicing angles, dropping targets, with terrifying efficiency. Marco moved through the maze of steel like a ghost. He felt a strange clarity. For years, the violence of his life had felt heavy, a burden of his ambition. Tonight, it felt weightless. It felt righteous. Every trigger pull was a receipt for the fear they had put in Nora's eyes. They reached the loading dock near a rusted freighter. A group of Vipers was trying to barricade themselves inside a small office. Luca kicked the door, the hinges screaming as it gave way. A flashbang grenade went in first, boom, followed by the team. Marco stepped over the debris, scanning the room. A terrified Viper, blinded and coughing, crawled backward, hands up. "Where is she?" Marco asked, pointing the barrel of his gun at the man's chest. "I don't know. I just guard the crates," the man stammered. Marco leaned in, his eyes dark voids. Wrong answer. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The promise of death was vibrating in the air around him. "The ship!" the man screamed. "Silas took her to the ship. They're casting off." Marco turned to his men, holstering his weapon with a sharp click. "Leave him. We take the ship." He sprinted toward the gangplank, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a hunter's drive. There would be no negotiations. There would be no mercy. Marco sprinted up the rusted gangway, the metal clanging beneath his boots like warning bells. The ship was a labyrinth of shadows and industrial decay, but he didn't need a map. He followed the sound of screaming. He burst onto the upper deck, wind whipping off the dark water, stinging his face. There, backed against the railing near the stern, was Silas. The Viper leader was sweating, his eyes wild, one arm wrapped tight around the neck of a terrified woman. He pressed a pistol into her temple, using her shaking body as a human shield against the 3 laser sights already dancing on his chest from Marco's men below. "Back off!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "I'll drop her! I swear to God, Dante, I'll paint the deck with her!" Marco held up a hand, signaling his snipers to hold fire. He stepped forward into the circle of light cast by the ship's flood lamps, holstering his own weapon with a slow, deliberate click. He walked toward them, unarmed, his hands open at his sides. "You're making a mistake, Silas," Marco said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind. It was the voice of a man discussing a ledger error, not a hostage situation. "You're the one making a mistake!" Silas spat, tightening his grip until the woman whimpered. "You crossed the line, Marco! This is my cargo! This is my business! You want her? You pay me! That's how this works! She's worth 50 grand on the market!" Marco stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the woman, Rosa. Her face was bruised, her shirt torn, terror etched into every line of her expression. But underneath the fear, he saw the resemblance. She had Nora's eyes. "She's not cargo," Marco said softly. "She's a mother. I don't care what she is," Silas yelled, the gun trembling against Rosa's head. "She's an asset. You want her back? You pay the debt. You pay me what she's worth." Marco reached into his pocket. For a second, Silas flinched, expecting a hidden weapon. But Marco only pulled out a crumpled, dirty $5 bill. He held it up, letting the floodlight catch the meager currency. "The debt is already paid," Marco said, his eyes locking onto Silas's with a cold, predatory intensity. "My client paid in advance. Full market value." Silas stared at the bill, confused. $5? Are you insane? "To you it's paper," Marco said, taking one more step. "To her daughter, it was everything she had. And in my book, taking a mother from a child isn't business, Silas. It's a bad debt." Marco's face hardened into stone. "And I'm here to collect." Silas's eyes widened as the realization hit him. Marco wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to execute. Silas started to pull the trigger, but he was too slow. Marco didn't need a gun. He lunged, closing the distance in a blur of motion. His hand chopped down on Silas's wrist, snapping bone. The gun clattered to the deck. Before Silas could scream, Marco seized him by the throat and slammed him backward over the railing. There was a sickening crunch as Silas hit the water below, then silence. Marco stood panting, straightening his suit jacket. He turned to Rosa, who was shivering against the bulkhead, unable to speak. He didn't offer a platitude. He just extended a hand, gentle now, the violence gone as quickly as it had arrived. "Come on," Marco said. "Nora is waiting." The drive back to the city was silent, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the grave that usually followed Marco's nights. It was the silence of disbelief. Rosa sat in the back of the armored SUV, wrapped in a wool blanket Marco had pulled from the emergency kit. She stared out the window as the streetlights flickered past, shivering not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash. Every few blocks, she would touch her own face or arms, as if checking to make sure she was really there, really solid, and not just a ghost floating at the bottom of the harbor. Marco sat in the front passenger seat, watching the city reassemble itself around them. The violence at the docks felt like a fever dream now, fading into the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt. He checked his watch. It had been less than 90 minutes since Nora had tapped his arm. In the span of a football game, he had started a war, ended a life, and saved another. "We're here," the driver announced softly. The SUV pulled up to the curb outside Mrs. Chen's deli, just down the street from the club. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a warm, flickering light on the sidewalk. Before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop, the door of the deli flew open. Nora stood there. She looked smaller than Marco remembered, a tiny figure framed by the doorway. She was clutching a cup of hot cocoa Mrs. Chen had given her, her eyes scanning the dark street with a terrifying intensity. Russo opened the back door of the SUV. Rosa stepped out, her legs unsteady. She took one breath of the city air, smelling of exhaust and rain, and let out a sob that sounded like something breaking. "Nora?" she whispered. The cup dropped from Nora's hands, splashing brown liquid across the pavement. She didn't scream. She didn't say a word. She just ran. She sprinted with every ounce of strength in her small body, her sneakers slapping against the concrete. Rosa fell to her knees, opening her arms just in time to catch her daughter. The impact nearly knocked her over. Nora buried her face in her mother's neck, her small hands clutching Rosa's shirt so tightly her knuckles turned white. They collapsed together on the sidewalk, a tangle of limbs and tears, rocking back and forth. The sound of their crying, a mixture of grief and relief, cut through the noise of the traffic, more powerful than any siren. Marco stepped out of the car but stayed by the door, leaning against the cold metal. He lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating the hard lines of his face for a brief second. He watched them from the shadows, an intruder in a moment of pure light. His men stood back, too, looking away, uncomfortable with the raw emotion of it all. They knew how to handle threats. They didn't know how to handle joy. Marco took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the night air. He felt a strange ache in his chest, a hollowness that money and power had never been able to fill. He had saved them, but he wasn't part of them. He was the monster who kept the other monsters away so moments like this could happen. And for tonight that was enough. Marco crushed his cigarette under the heel of his Italian loafer and stepped out of the shadows. As he entered the pool of neon lights spilling from the deli, Rosa stiffened. She pulled Nora back instinctively, her eyes widening in recognition. She knew who Marco Dante was. In this neighborhood, his face was more recognizable than the mayor's, and usually, his presence meant a debt was due. But Nora didn't pull back. She broke free from her mother's grip and took a step toward him, wiping her tear-streaked face with the back of her hand. Marco stopped 3 feet away. He didn't smile. Smiling wasn't in his nature, but the hardness around his eyes had softened. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the crumpled $5 bill. It was creased and dirty, looking utterly ridiculous against his manicured hand, but Marco handled it with more reverence than he showed the stacks of hundreds he handled daily. He crouched down one last time, extending the bill toward Nora. "Here," Marco said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'm refunding your deposit." Nora blinked, looking from the money to his face. "But I hired you." "You overpaid," Marco lied smoothly. "Services were on the house tonight." He pressed the bill into her small palm and closed her fingers around it. "Put this back in your jar. Save it for something important. And if anyone bothers you or your mother again, anyone at all, you tell them Marco Dante is holding your contract. Do you understand?" Nora nodded solemnly. Then, before Marco could stand up, she lunged forward. She threw her small arms around his neck, burying her face in the expensive fabric of his suit. The smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne didn't deter her. Marco froze. His hands, lethal weapons that had ended a life less than an hour ago, hovered awkwardly in the air. Finally, he gently patted her back. It was a clumsy gesture, but it was the most honest one he had made in years. "Thank you," she whispered into his ear. Marco stood up abruptly, clearing his throat. He gave a curt nod to Rosa, who was watching him with a look of stunned gratitude, and turned toward his waiting SUV. He slid into the leather seat, the heavy door thudding shut to seal him back inside his fortress of silence. As the car pulled away, Russo looked in the rearview mirror, shaking his head in disbelief. "Boss," Russo said quietly. We just started a war with the cartel. We burned favors, risked the business, and exposed the crew. All for $5. Was it worth it? Marco looked out the window. He watched Nora and her mother walking into the safety of the deli, hand in hand. He touched his chest, where the bill had rested against his heart. To the world, it was just a piece of cotton and linen worth less than a cup of coffee. But Marco knew the truth. It was the price of his redemption. Yeah, Marco said, closing his eyes as the city lights blurred by. Best deal I ever made.